When I say Sony, you say low light. Sony, did you actually say it? What's going on, guys? It's Kofi Boa, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about the low light capabilities of the Sony FX30. Now, we are gonna do some in-studio testing with color charts and all that fun stuff, but we're also gonna do some comparisons between my A7IV and the Sony FX6. And one more thing, we're gonna confirm whether or not Sony lied about having dual base ISO. So let's get into it. So first things first, we are going to do our classic studio tests where we're going to check different ISO values for S-Log3 on the Sony FX30 to find out where things fall apart. So I'll be the first to admit, I'm not a giant scientific type of person. I don't do a lot of lab tests, so if this is done incorrectly, you let me know. But I did want to try out each of the ISO values in S-Log3 before getting into our low light situation. Now, just for fun, I did use some values that are below 800 ISO. The base is going to be 800, but you can use values underneath it, which gives you clean shadows, but in dynamic range situations where you are going to have a lot of highlights and shadows, not recommended. Now, spoiler alert, 1250 and 1600 ISO is perfectly usable on the Sony FX30, but what I really wanted to talk about is the dual base ISO at 2500. Now, there's been a lot of controversy around whether or not it's a real dual base ISO, and here is some comparisons. Now, the low light scenario comparison is going to be later on in this video, but even in this situation where it's well lit and we're using the different ISO values, you are going to notice some differences in the noise between 2000, 2500, and 3200. What I wanted to do is go one step backwards and one step forwards to see what the image is looking like. Now, once we move past our high base ISO at 2500, past 3200, because we've already seen that already, we're gonna move into the 4000, the 6400, the 8000, even up to 10,000 ISO. And this is where you're gonna see the image start to break down a little bit. Now, what may save you when you're in well-lit situations is even using a higher ISO, it doesn't look as bad. And with YouTube compression, the noise isn't as glaring, but you're starting to notice the image is going to break down a little bit, right up until we get into 10,000 ISO. Now, for this next segment, we're going to go into comparing the Sony FX30, the Sony A7IV, and the Sony FX6 at different ISO values, particularly at base ISOs, to find out that if the camera's performing at its best, which one is actually better. When you compare cameras at their ISO values, but one's not the base and the other one is, clearly one might be the winner because it's using the settings that it works the best at. So we're gonna go through each of the base ISOs in the low base and high base in a low light situation and find out how they look between the two, or three. Now, before we start this, I just want to kind of get this out of the way and debunk it right away. The Sony FX30 does have dual base ISO. I'm not really sure where things went wrong and people started talking about this camera being a lie and the ISO values aren't really what they are, but there definitely is dual base ISO when you compare the two images together. I shot at 2000 and 2500 ISO. I graded them the exact same way and punched in to find out if my shadows were noisy, but when I actually found out was when I zoomed in on my shadows, the noise is noticeably better at 2500 versus 2000. Now, when you're using high base ISO, you're not completely absolved from having a little bit of noise, but you try to mitigate that by using lower Cine EI values to make sure that you're overexposing to bring down your noise floor. But at 2500 base ISO versus the 2000, it's there, it's noticeable, and I don't know why people are saying otherwise. Now at 800 ISO, things look pretty clean across the board between the A7IV, FX6, and the Sony FX30, but the hard part is that there isn't quite enough exposure, and you're gonna have to bump things up a bit. This is where you're gonna go up to 2500 as your base ISO. Now because there's a 2500 base ISO in the Sony FX30, it only makes sense to actually compare 2500 ISO on the FX6 and the A7IV. Now this really quick comparison, all three clips look pretty good. The A7IV is going to have that downsampling and it's in full frame, so it does look a little bit sharper, a little bit more contrasty. And then you have the FX30 and the FX6 that look pretty close together to each other. Now I will say at the base ISO, at 2500 ISO, the FX30 finds its second high base, so it's going to look clean. And because you're working with two other full frame sensors, 2500 ISO and something like the FX6 and the A7IV is not a problem for it. And all three are gonna look pretty clean, and that's pretty much what I expected. So let's actually flip the script and compare what happens when you test at the high base ISOs of other cameras with the Sony FX30. And if you're gonna jump up to 12,800 ISO like the Sony FX6, it's gonna be all the way screwed up. Even the Sony A7IV, when it's set to 12,800, it doesn't look nearly as good as something like the Sony FX6. Now we're at 12,800 ISO, I would recommend not doing this on a crop sensor camera like the Sony FX30. You're gonna have more pronounced noise, especially on an APS-C camera, and honestly, when you're working with smaller sensors, you're going to need a lot of light. The A7IV, it does a little bit better, but not by much, because you are gonna see a lot of noise at 12,800 as well. But that's to be expected because it doesn't have a dual base ISO at that value. And this is where the Sony FX6 pulls away, because the image is amazingly clean at the high base of 12,800. Now personally for me, because I'm using Cine EI most of the time, I don't really deviate away from using 12,800 as my high base. I'm not going to jump up into the 16,000s and above, but the FX6 is going to look the cleanest at that high base ISO at 12,800. So all we have is left is to compare everybody's ISOs at their bases and their best performance against each other. The Sony FX6 at 12,800, the Sony FX30 at 2500, and the Sony A7IV at 3200. Now when you're working with high base ISO cameras, when you go into that 3200, that 2500, or that 12,800, you are going to have a little bit of noise. It's something that's really hard to avoid. Now overall, which one do I think looks the best out of all of them? It's going to go back to the Sony FX6, and that's because its high base ISO is the absolute highest out of all the three cameras. But for a cinema camera that costs as much as it does, it is going to be something that's unsurprising that that's going to be our winner. And they all look pretty good, but for a camera that has the highest base ISO, it's going to be the Sony FX6 that takes this away. Now, hopefully a lot of questions about the low light on the FX30 have been answered, but there is one thing left that a lot of you guys are used to seeing, and that's a nighttime montage of me setting this up to 2500 ISO with some lo-fi hip hop and then finding out what my final thoughts are. All right, so you're gonna notice that the fog is sold separately. This is not an effect, this is just what the city looks like. It just had rain last night while I was getting this low light test. Now I was using the DZO 25mm t2.1 to get some of these shots of the city, but with a crop sensor camera, it's looking more like a 35mm look. Now what I'm gonna say is low light doesn't necessarily mean no light. If you guys are running and gunning in low light situations, you're going to have to be okay with two things. One, you're gonna have to use a lot of the ambient light that's available, from street lights to lights in a store or anything that you can find in order to give you some exposure, but you're also gonna have to be okay with crushing down your blacks a little bit. If you're going for a lifted look while shooting in low light situations on a crop sensor camera, you're unfortunately going to have a bad time. After everything, I'm going to say that the low light in this camera is really good. And for people that are still mincing over the fact that it's an APS-C camera or that it's not a $5,000 body, this thing works really well. And this low light test for me, shooting at T2.1, not even at like an f1.4 or anything like that, it looks pretty good for what it is. Oh, and we got Popeyes after. That being said, I hope I answered some questions about the Sony FX30 and its low light performance. It does have dual base ISO. I don't know where that whole thing went awry. It does have great low light performance, even though it has a smaller sensor, and it is still something that's going to be versatile that you'll use in your bag. And compared to the other cameras I have, it holds up pretty well and it does pretty decently in terms of its performance. That being said, if you guys do like this video, make sure you comment, like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace. you.